Very good evening to you all, and a warm welcome back to our normal Wednesday night Bible studies. Christmas is a thing of the past. It came and it went. I hope you had as good a one as you could possibly have this year, and let me wish a Happy New Year to everybody. But we are back here on a Wednesday because this is the first Wednesday, normal Wednesday in January, and so we are back on our normal Wednesday evening Bible study time here on our YouTube channels and our Facebook channel from the Bethel Bush. It's a return to normality after Christmas, but I suppose, like you all, this is anything but normal, isn't it? And it seems to be getting more and more strange by the week. And so we'll try and carry on as best we can this evening in the circumstances that we're all in the nation. Our Bible study tonight, as promised, we are looking at Mark's Gospel. We're continuing to look at Mark's Gospel as we did for the majority of last year. We took a bit of a break over Christmas, but for the majority of last year, we looked at Mark's Gospel together. And as promised, we are leaving chapter 13 behind us, and I thoroughly enjoyed looking at chapter 13. But we finished it, and we are leaving it behind us, and we are moving this evening onto chapter 14. Our studies so far, and if you've been involved all the way through, if you're a member of the Bush and can remember that far back when we started these studies on a Sunday in the church, when we could all meet together as we've been building through the book of Mark, it seems that we have been building and walking the road to Calvary. We've been certainly building in our time with Jesus in his earthly ministry and through his teaching and through his miracles. We have been building up to the cross of Calvary. And Jesus talks about it more and more the further we get into the book of Mark. And certainly when we reach chapters 8 and chapter 9, he talks about the cross an awful lot. He talks about his death an awful lot, his rejection, what men are going to do to him. And he talks about his resurrection too. But then in chapter 11, as Jesus comes to Jerusalem and as he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, we seem to have had this side issue that we've been looking at for the last couple of weeks, the last couple of months actually. It's almost digression where Jesus stops talking about the cross so much and starts to talk almost exclusively about the city and the people of Jerusalem itself. And he's been very challenging over these last couple of weeks when he's talked about Jerusalem. And he speaks in this very challenging way and speaks of their judgment for their rejection of God, for their rejection of the prophets, and ultimately their rejection of him as God's Messiah and as God's Son. And so we've looked at that, haven't we, over these last couple of times that we've looked at the book of Mark. The parable of the tenants is a warning of judgment on Jerusalem. The fig tree is a warning of judgment on Jerusalem. And then the Olivet Discourse that we looked at in chapter 13 is an out-and-out description of the judgment on Jerusalem. And so for these three chapters, chapter 11, 12 and 13, we've been looking at Jerusalem. And our thoughts have been towards Jerusalem. And it's almost as if Calvary has been pushed to the side and the cross has been pushed to the side. And we've almost forgotten about the cross of Jesus, about the sacrifice of Jesus as we've been looking at the issue of Jerusalem. But now we get to chapter 14 and now we come back fully, firmly to the cross of Jesus Christ. This chapter is all about the cross of Jesus, and not only this chapter, but chapter 15 and chapter 16 as well. As we come to the end of the book of Mark, they are all centered around the death and the resurrection of Jesus. So we've been off on a bit of a tangent towards Jerusalem in these last three chapters, but now we are firmly back on the road to Calvary. Our focus is on the cross of Christ and the sacrifice of Christ. Mark 14, and it's quite a long chapter. I'm not going to read it all this evening. In fact, I'm only going to read 2 verses of it, but it may well be worth you while sort of reading the whole of the chapter together, because it'll take us a good couple. We'll be well into 2021, by the time we finish Mark 14. We may even be out of lockdown by the time we finish Mark 14, because it's a long and involved chapter. But as you read it, it becomes obvious to you as you do read it that it's a chapter of preparation. Because from start to finish, it tells the story of different people preparing for the events that are going to happen. And the event that is going to happen is the cross of Christ, the death of Christ. And so Mark 14 is a chapter of preparation for this monumental, history-changing, and perhaps we can go further than that and say eternity-changing event and events of Mark chapter 15. So our eyes are on chapter 15, which is the death of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus. Our eyes are on chapter 16, which is the resurrection of Jesus. But Mark 14 prepares us for those two events. And it's different groups of people preparing themselves in different ways for those two events, the death of Jesus in Mark 15, the resurrection of Jesus in Mark 16, but Mark 14 is all about preparation. If you were to read it this evening, and as I said, I suggest that you do, then you read that everyone here in this chapter 14, is preparing. The chief priests and the scribes are preparing. The woman with the alabaster flask is preparing. Judas is preparing. The disciples are preparing. Peter is preparing. Jesus is preparing. There are plans being made wherever you look in Mark 14. Everybody is planning for something. Everybody is preparing for something. They are happening all over the place. And tonight I want to start by looking at one of those plans, or one of those groups of people, anyway, who are planning and preparing for the events that will come in Mark 15 and Mark 16. And I'm going to read the first two verses of Mark chapter 14 for us this evening, just as an introduction, and just this is what we'll be looking at in these next few minutes. Mark 14 verses 1 and 2 say this: After 2 days it was Passover and the feast of unleavened bread. And the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might take him by trickery and put him to death. But, they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar of the people. And so the group of people who plan first in this chapter of plans, or this chapter of preparation, the first plan is put together by a group that Mark describes as the chief priests and the scribes, the Jewish leaders. They are planning, they are plotting, and they are preparing. And here is their plan revealed to us by Mark in these first two verses. Their plan was this: to kill Jesus. Purely and simply, it's a dreadful plan, an awful plan, a horrible plan, a murderous plan. Jesus has been teaching, he has been preaching, he has been talking about God's love, about God's forgiveness, about God's mercy, about God's plans, about God in the past and God in the present and God in the future. And the Jewish leaders' response to this is to kill Jesus, to put an end to this teaching, to put an end to his popularity. And I suppose these last three chapters that we have read, 11, 12 and 13, where Jesus talks about Jerusalem and talks in these challenging ways and talks about their judgment and their rejection of the things of God, this has hastened the plan of these Jewish leaders. They have hated what he has been saying, particularly in these last three chapters. And this plan is speeding its way towards their conclusion. They want an end to this teaching. They want an end to his popularity. They want an end to his threat to their way of life. And so, Mark tells us, they are seeking here in Mark 14 how they might take him, what process they are going to use, how they can trick him, and how they can be underhanded, and how they can trap him, put him on trial, and put him to death. That's their plan, to make an end to the life of Jesus. That is written for us in Mark 14. But when you think of it, there is nothing new to this plan. Because this same group of people have been planning this, not just at this point in Mark 14, but they've been planning this for quite a while. If you will look back into John's Gospel, in John chapter 11, John chapter 11 is that wonderful chapter of the raising of Lazarus from the dead. And in John 11, just after Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, we are told of the same plot by the same group of people. Such a plot, a murderous, awful plot against Jesus by the same group of people. Let me read it to you, or a passage from John chapter 11. It says this: "Then many of the Jews who had come to Mary and seen the things that Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things that Jesus did. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, 'What shall we do? For this man works many signs. And if we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation.' And one of them, Caiaphas, being the high priest that year, said to them, 'You know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish.' Now this he did not say on his own authority, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for that nation only, but also that he would gather together in one the children of God who were scattered abroad. Then, from that day on, they plotted to put him to death." And so Mark's account of the plan of these Jewish leaders is not new. There's nothing new in what Mark is saying, because here we have a reminder from John that this plan has been going for quite a while. It's been in the process for quite a while. And it's a reminder at the beginning of Mark 14 that these same group of men, this same group of Jewish leaders, are still plotting. The chief priests and the scribes are still plotting to kill Jesus. And the last 3 chapters and all he said hasn't helped that at all. In fact, it's made those plans hasten towards their conclusion. So Mark tells us nothing new in verse 1 when he tells us about the plans of the chief priests. But he does tell us something new as he gets to the end of verse 2. Because in verse 2, he tells us that the chief priests have a plan, but he also tells us that the chief priests and the scribes have a timetable, that they have a plan to kill Jesus, and they have a timetable of when they want to do it. We want to kill him, they say, but not during the feast, not during the Passover, because they are worried that that would cause an uproar among the people who are welcoming of him and believing in him. So they are planning to kill him, but they are planning to kill him with one stipulation. It's not to be during the feast, because they are worried about the people. There are no other stipulations that Mark mentions. We want to kill him, they say. We don't care how. We don't care about the circumstances. We don't care where. The one detail that these chief priests and scribes are interested in is when it doesn't happen. The only thing they're interested in is the timetable. It shouldn't happen, they say, during the feast. That was what was important to these men. And it's important to them because they were afraid of the reaction of the crowd. They didn't want a riot. They didn't want to give the thousands upon thousands of people who would be in Jerusalem at that time, they didn't want to give them the opportunity to rise up in defense of Jesus. Now, as we read through the rest of the book of Mark, as we'll come to over the next few weeks, as it panned out, these chief priests and scribes had given the people far too much credit, because the crowd, in their fickleness, turned on a sixpence in their attitude to Jesus. And the same men and women who were throwing their clothes down for his donkey to walk over and waving palm leaves in front of him and shouting, Hosanna, they would be the very ones who would shout, crucify him, in just a few days' time. Now, the fickleness of the crowd was astounding. But these chief priests and scribes didn't know that. It took them by surprise. And their only stipulation, to avoid a riot, to avoid an uprising, to avoid people coming to the defense or to the aid of Jesus, was that this execution or this murder wouldn't happen during the feast. That was their only stipulation. Yet it's interesting this evening, and particularly in the context of what we are reading in the book of Mark, this chapter of preparation, that for all the planning of these chief priests and Pharisees and scribes, for all their plotting, for all their scheming, they could not achieve their goal. Yes, they achieved their goal of the execution of Jesus, but in no way did they achieve their goal in terms of the timing of the death of Jesus. Let's kill him, they say, but not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. Now, they achieved the first part, they executed him, but the timetable they got wrong absolutely, completely. Now, the chief priests and the scribes, and this is interesting to me as I've read these first two verses in Mark, the chief priests and the scribes are not the only ones who have a very, very similar plot, both to kill Jesus and have a very specific timetable in mind. They are not the only ones who try and ultimately fail in regard to the timing of the death of Jesus. Right back in the beginning of the earthly life of Jesus, in Matthew chapter 2, in a passage that we may have read over these last couple of weeks because it's a Christmas passage, but in the brightness and the lightness of Christmas, and in the star and the stable and the choirs of angels and all these wonderful things, there is an extremely dark story, an extremely evil and wicked story, and it concerns Herod, the king of the Jews, who is visited by the wise men because they naturally go to Jerusalem. They naturally go to a palace and to a king because they are looking for a baby born to be king of the Jews. They come to Herod and they talk to Herod about the star that they have seen and ask him, where is he who is to be born king of the Jews? And from that moment on, Herod plots to get rid of this baby. And so he does the same thing as the chief priests and the scribes. He plots the death of Jesus. He plots to put an end to him, to get rid of him, to stop this threat to his position and to his way of life, exactly the same way the chief priests and the scribes did. Now, Herod has a specific timetable in mind too. He wants to do this as quickly as possible. So he wants to achieve the destruction of Jesus and the murder of Jesus as quickly as possible. And so he plots and he plans and he prepares. He wants to put an early end to the life of Jesus before there is an earthly ministry, before there are miracles, before Jesus has the chance to teach or to say anything. He wants the life of Jesus, Matthew tells us, to end before he reaches the age of 2 years old. And so Herod goes to this murderous effort to ensure that is the case. He sends his soldiers in one of the worst acts you can ever imagine. He sends his soldiers to kill all male children under the age of 2 in Bethlehem, in his effort to apply his timetable to the death of Jesus. And so here is another man who says, look, I want to kill Jesus, and I have a very specific timetable in mind. I want to do it before he reaches the age of 2. But just the same as the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees in Mark chapter 14, Herod fails in part of his plan. Yes, Jesus is put to death. Yes, Jesus is executed, but not according to the timetable of Herod. Herod wants to do it before Jesus is 2 years old, but Herod fails in that attempt, in that plot. Joseph, as we read in Matthew chapter 2, is divinely warned in a dream of the plot against Jesus, and so he takes Mary and Jesus to Egypt, thus escaping the plans and the plots and the schemes of Herod. And so another plan, another plot, that to influence the timetable of the death of Jesus, which ultimately fails. Then in Luke chapter 4, Jesus has grown up now, and Jesus is around 30 years of age, and he is right at the beginning of his earthly ministry. He is about to come onto the scene, and the miracles are about to begin, and his wonderful teaching is about to begin. And he goes to Nazareth, which is the town that he grew up in, his hometown, if you like. And so he goes to Nazareth in Luke chapter 4, and he preaches there at the synagogue in Nazareth. He says some wonderful things, and then he says some very controversial things, and people are getting more incensed as they listen to him. This is Joseph's son, they say. And as he continues to speak and continues to challenge them and continues to tell them who he really is, then this crowd of people become more and more angry. They become more and more agitated, more and more incensed at what he has to say. And they come up with a plot to kill Jesus. And it's spur of the moment, it's off the cuff, but it is yet another plot, another plan to kill Jesus. And here is another group of people, as well as the chief priests, as well as Herod, who come up with a plan to kill Jesus, but not only to kill him, to impose their will on the timing of the death of Jesus. They want to put an end to his words now, today. They are angry at what he says. They are angry at what he teaches. And so they plan amongst themselves, look, we'll put an end to him, and we'll put an end to him now, when he's 30, at the beginning of his earthly ministry, before he goes on to say anything else, before he goes on to do anything else. We'll put an end to him now. His words, his teachings, we're going to stop them now. We're going to kill him now. And so Luke tells us in chapter 4 of his gospel that they, in their anger, they throw him out of their city, and not only that, they lead him towards a hill where their murderous intent is to kill him by pushing him off a cliff. And so they have a plan to kill Jesus, and they have a timetable. We're going to do it now, today, right at this moment when he's 30 years old. Yet as we read Luke chapter 4, yet again, this plan fails. Yes, Jesus dies, but not on that day. Yes, Jesus is executed, but not on that day. Their timetable, or their attempt to impose their will on the timing of the death of Jesus, yet again fails. Luke tells us, and I really like this verse in Luke. Luke tells us that Jesus simply, miraculously, just walks through the crowd and makes his way. You can imagine this crowd in their anger, in their frustration, are looking to push Jesus and murder him and push him off a cliff, and he just walks through them and goes about his daily life. It must have been a great one. I wonder how long it took this angry mob to realize that Jesus wasn't there anymore. and that miraculously he had just walked through them. And so a pattern seems to be emerging here, doesn't it? There's plots to kill Jesus. The chief priests are plotting. The scribes are plotting. The Pharisees are plotting. And then Herod is plotting to kill Jesus. The angry mob in Nazareth are plotting to kill Jesus. And each one of those groups of people are seeking to impose their will on the timing of the death of Jesus. But a pattern emerges. Yes, Jesus dies, but not according to the timetable of the Pharisees, not according to the timetable of the chief priests or the scribes, not according to the timetable of Herod or of this angry mob. You know, a pattern seems to be emerging here, and I think the reason behind that is we have left out just one other person who is planning and preparing in Mark chapter 14. Yes, the chief priests are planning. Judas is planning. The disciples are planning. The woman with the alabaster jar is planning and preparing. But we've left out another person because God is planning here in Mark chapter 14. God is preparing too. God's plans, God's purposes are all the way through Mark chapter 14. And so you have all these people on the periphery. They are making their plans. They are making their plots. But at the center of it all, you have God who is planning and preparing too. Peter tells us those things in Acts chapter 2. After the death of Jesus and the ascension of Jesus, he talks to the crowd in Jerusalem. And he talks to them about what has happened over these last couple of weeks. And these are the words that he says in Acts chapter 2. Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves also know, him being delivered up by the determined purpose and knowledge of God. You see, it's not only these groups of people who are planning and preparing in Mark chapter 14. God is planning and preparing in Mark chapter 14. God is planning to, all through this chapter, and in fact all the way through the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, you see the plan and the purpose of God running through everything. Now, I said earlier that the chief priests and the scribes, there is nothing new to their plan in Mark chapter 14, because they have been planning to kill Jesus for quite a long time. The death of Jesus has been in their plans and purposes for quite a long time. But if you think their plan has gone back in the past, then it's nothing to how long this plan of God has been around. Revelation chapter 13 speaks of Jesus and tells us that he is the Lamb slain before the foundation of the earth. You can't go back further than that, can you? How long God has been planning this. Those words in Revelation would tell us that before he created the world, God had been planning the death, the sacrifice of his dear Son. You know, between the creation of the world and Mark chapter 14, there are thousands and thousands of years. And so this plan has been thousands of years in the making. Thousands of years in the planning. The sacrifice of Jesus, and not just the sacrifice of Jesus, not just the death of Jesus, but God has his own timetable. The chief priests had a timetable, didn't they? Not during the feast. Herod had a timetable. Let's kill him before he is two. The angry mob had a timetable. Let's put an end to him today. All of those plans failed, and now God has a timetable. Paul talks about it in Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4. He says this, one of my favourite Christmas verses, this one. He says, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. When the fullness of time had come. And perhaps another way of saying that would be at the right time. Perhaps another way of saying it would be at God's time. According to his timetable, in his time, he sends forth his Son to redeem those who were under the law. Jesus talked about that timetable of God all the way through his earthly ministry. He speaks of it as his hour. In John chapter 2, at the first miracle of Christ, in the wedding in Cana, the water into wine, he tells Mary, his mother, my hour has not yet come. In John chapter 7, he tells the people of Galilee, once again, my time has not yet come. In John chapter 8, John tells us that Jesus was speaking in Jerusalem, that he spoke openly in the temple while there were threats against his life, while there was a plot there to kill him. Yet, says John, no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. The death of Jesus is in the plan and the purpose of God. It has always been God's plan to send his Son to die for the sins of the world. And that much is clear from his word. But what is also clear, and especially as we read here in Mark chapter 14, is that God has planned this down to the most minute detail. What is clear from Mark's gospel is God has planned the exact moment of the death of Jesus in the fullness of his time, at his appointed hour. And the timetable of the chief priests, when it conflicts with God's, they fail. And the timetable of Herod, when it conflicts with God, it fails. And the timetable of the angry mob in Nazareth, when it conflicts with God, it fails. In the drama of Mark chapter 14 and 15. And these next two chapters, Mark 14 and 15 and 16, are full of drama. And they're full of intrigue. And they're full of plots and plans and betrayals and broken promises and denials and rejection. And what you have to remember all the way through that is that God is in total control of the whole thing. Nothing but nothing knocks him off course. God is the master planner. Throughout all of this process, nothing but nothing alters his path, and he is not reacting to anything. As we go back to that, or as we come to a close this evening, let's look back at that verse, or those two verses that we have read. Mark 14 and verses 1 to 2. After 2 days it was Passover, and the feast of unleavened bread. And the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might take him by trickery, and put him to death. But they said, not during the feast, let there be an uproar of the people. Their timetable, the one thing that was important to them, is that the death of Christ not happen in a full Jerusalem. That the death of Christ not happen during the feast. That the death of Christ not be a part of these Passover celebrations and festivities. That was their timetable. But that timetable wasn't God's. And it's a matter of historical fact as we read Mark 15, that Jesus died right slap bang in the middle of a crowded Jerusalem. that Jesus died right slap bang in the middle of the feast of Passover, the feast of unleavened bread. The chief priests and the scribes, they plotted not to kill him during that point. That was the only thing that they were worried about. But their timetable clashed with the timetable of God. And when the plans and the schemes and the timetables of men and women clash with the timetable of God, there is only ever one outcome. God will always be in control of his plan and his purpose. I'm not a one for titling my sermons, but I've got into the habit a little bit since I've been doing these online studies, because when I upload them onto YouTube or onto Facebook, then it always asks me for a description or a title, and so I put the date, but I also put a bit of a title of what the sermon is about. And you'll notice, or you may have noticed when you clicked on the YouTube link, that I titled this sermon of Mice and Men. And I'm sure you reckon, or many of you will recognise that anyway. It's taken from a book of the same name that is popular with secondary school curriculums. And it's taken, the title of that book was taken from a poem of the same name. And it's an old Scottish poem, but in modern English, it says this: "The best laid schemes of mice and men so quickly go awry." No, we can't argue with that, can we? Because we've seen that happening in our own lives in the most trivial of things, but we've seen it happen all over the world, particularly this year, and it's still happening in these weeks and these months that we are in. The current situation is certainly telling us that the best laid schemes, and the best laid plans, and the most organised preparation of mice and men can so quickly go awry. None of us, I suppose, have planned to be in the position that we are in this evening. Certainly not for me. Now, I would be expecting this evening to be in our kitchen in the bush with a cup of tea and maybe a Welsh cake, and we would be talking about these type of things together. But our plans so quickly go away and go awry, and life happens and things happen and they knock us off course and we go in another direction. And that's right, that's life. That's what life is all about. But not for God. Even in the drama of Mark 14, with plots and plans and schemes and betrayal and rejection and denials and soldiers and all the rest of the things that we look at over these next couple of months, God is in total control. He is the master planner. He reacts to nothing. We could say this evening, God is neither a man or a mouse. And so his plans will come to pass. What he has planned come to fruition. And it's going to be in his way, and it's going to be in his time, according to his timetable. Not to Herod's time, not to the baying angry crowd in Nazareth's time, not to the chief priests and the scribes' time, but in his time and at his hour. We can comfort ourselves this evening knowing that the God of Mark 14, the God who planned the gospel, the story of redemption, the God who has planned the means of redemption in the giving of his Son, who has planned that before the foundation of the world, is our God for you and me on this Wednesday night in January in 2021. His plans always come to fruition. He is not taken by surprise by anything. Nothing knocks him off course, and he doesn't have to react to any situation. That means tonight that there is no lockdown that has knocked God off course. There is no virus or pandemic that he is reacting to. His plans, his purposes come to perfect fruition according to the fullness of his time at his hour. Now we can take peace with that this evening. We can take comfort with that this evening, in knowing that even in the how huge this situation is that the world seems to be finding itself in, there is a God who is greater, more wonderful, more glorious, more able, more mighty than all of that. He's our God. He has provided the means for our salvation, and he dwells within us, within our hearts through his dear Son, as we put our faith and our trust in him. We've got a long way to go in this chapter of plans and preparations, but we realize and we recognize again tonight that at the heart of it is a God who has been planning from eternity past. The redemption is in his hands. The gospel is in his hands. Forgiveness is in his hands. Grace and mercy are in his hands. Providence is in his hands, even for you and for me as we walk with him once again this evening. Just to note that as I've put some messages on Facebook that we are still in lockdown, and so unfortunately this situation with the church and us being able to physically meet hasn't changed at all. So the church continues to be closed over these next couple of weeks until we hear otherwise, or until this lockdown is lifted. So we'll continue to meet together on a Sunday morning, 10:30. I'll share just a couple of short thoughts with you on a Sunday morning, and we'll continue, God willing, to look in depth at the book of Mark and Mark chapter 14 together on a Wednesday evening too. So they'll continue over these next few weeks. Let's close our time, shall we, with a word of prayer. And I thank the Lord for his presence with us this evening, and ask him to continue to be with us, continue to bless us and to lead us and to guide us as we go forward and walk with him. Lord, we do thank you for this lovely time that we have had together in your presence, Lord, and this opportunity, even in the strangeness and the anxiety of this world, that we have had the opportunity to look around, look at your word, and to consider it once again and to ponder it, and let it speak to our hearts and speak to our minds, and let it guide us in our walk and in our actions. Lord, we do thank you for Jesus this evening, as we have read of him, as we have considered him, as we have thought again, Lord, about his ministry, his words, his teaching, what he says about you. We thank you, Lord, for his sacrifice that has given us, Lord, the access, that free access, Lord, that we have even to your throne of grace. Lord, that we can be included in your fold and family, that we are sons and daughters of the living God, Lord, not based on what we have done for you, but based on what he has done even for us. We thank you for Jesus. We thank you for this plan of salvation, Lord, that we have looked at this evening. Lord, this plan, thousands of years in the making, that nothing has knocked it off course. Nothing has stopped it in any way, Lord. But in the fullness of time, you have given your dear Son to redeem the world, even back to you. Lord, I thank you for that, God, and I thank you for the joy and the comfort and the peace that knowledge brings, Lord. Lord, that we have a God who is greater than the circumstances that we see round and about us. And those circumstances, Lord, are serious and they're concerning to us. But I thank you tonight, Lord, that you are greater than all that you are mightier than all that, and I can rest in your wonderful hands. I can rest in your plans and your purposes, and I thank you even for that this evening. I thank you, Lord, for the time that we have had together, and I would pray, Lord, that you would continue to look after us, that you would continue to keep us safe, Lord, and you would give us the opportunity to meet up even through these means once again, Lord, on Sunday, to look more at your word, Lord, and think more about you, and to praise and to worship your lovely name. In Jesus' name, amen.